the honor to have Professor Renee Adam from Saïd Business School, Oxford, to give us presentation keynote speech on the how to save the world. Before that, I'd like to give brief introduction about Professor Adam. And she received she's a truly global scholars and examining this research information from boards and bank governance, and she's a distinguished research profile in gender diversity research and published in journal and have global influence. My research inspired by her research as well. I mean, she has the great past intrinsic capacity. I mean, also worked in a Queensland University, and she started Federal Reserve Bank of New York and joined the Stockholm School of Business Economics, and worked also for the University of Queensland. We talked yesterday about that, and University of South Wales, and hold few faculty positions in Germany, Italy, and Japan, Norway, Sweden, and US. And she's also fellow of the European Corporate Governance Institute. And most distinctively, she won the Female Career Awards as highlights of her academic career, because these awards honor twice a year outstanding female academia career outside the HEC. So Renee won the first edition in 2019. So her main research focused on organization design and problems which stimulate effective governance of address the issues, and which we will be reflecting to her research at the talk today, how to save the world. So without any further delay, I would like to welcome Renee's talk to give us a talk. Thank you very much. The first 40 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I do want to leave some time for debate. So could you wave your hand when I'm reaching about 40 minutes? Yeah, because obviously the title was deliberately a bit provocative, right? So so I want to leave time for debate. So thanks very much for the great welcome. Thanks everyone thanks for inviting me to be a keynote. This is my first BAFA conference. I'm really happy to be here. So I joined Oxford end of 2018, and then pandemic and everything. So I didn't really get to meet many people in the UK yet. As Josh said, I've moved around a lot. So this is really great to actually have the chance to meet a bunch of people in the UK, and I need to do more of that. Unfortunately, I also have to apologize because I have to leave this afternoon. So, but hopefully there'll be future opportunities. And also, it's a great delight to be in Sheffield, a very cool city. I've been here before, super cool. So thank you so much for having me here. All right, so let's get down to business. So, well, we all know that the world is falling to pieces, right? And so everyone's trying to figure out how we're going to stop that from happening. And I would roughly say that there's two approaches to solving all of our problems. So the first is processes. What do I mean by processes? Regulation and legislation. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about sustainability processes and legislation. The second approach, I would say, is focus on people. And there I'm going to be emphasizing what people are saying about directors, what people are saying about women, what people are saying about the next generation. And also I'm going to say a little bit about finance academics. Do we have a role in trying to save the world? So what are some current save the world narratives around processes and people? Well, so first, we need to fix corporations with processes. That's what the regulators tell us. I don't know how many of you follow the European Union Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative, but they're pretty strong on the idea that, well, we really need to regulate, we need to legislate, we need to do something, right? And this needs to be a country level approach or European Union level approach to solving our problems, in particular in the area of sustainable corporate governance, CSR, and ESG. And well, why do we need processes? Well, because the European Union says that directors cannot be relied on as they are not stakeholder oriented enough. Now, it's sort of interesting. I've studied directors a long time in my career, and I'm like, well, how do they know this? Well, they know this because there was a study by Ernst & Young that told them that directors tend to favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value over stakeholder interest. Okay, so obviously, given that Ernst & Young told them that directors are too short-sighted, we need to regulate, is essentially what the European Union is saying. Now, so there's the process approach, but there's also the people approach. And in particular, there's a lot of sort of ideas floating around related to gender. For example, Catalyst had this article published, I think it was in Harvard Business Review, and they basically argued that if we have more women leaders, then that will lead to higher levels of corporate social responsibility. Okay, so basically, you could regulate, you could legislate, or you could also just have a bunch of women in leadership positions and we've solved all the problems. Right? So job done, I can go. Okay, and then of course, people say, well, we can't do anything. It's the next generation. They have to solve all of our problems, right? All right, so I'm going to take, these are some stories that are floating around, and I'm going to take a bit of an evidence-based approach in this talk. And I'm going to show you data, measures, and ideas from Oxford MBA students, and from a couple of my papers. So I have a paper with a corporate law scholar. You'll see why the corporate law angle is relevant in a little bit. So I have a paper called Shareholders and Stakeholders Around the World. I also have a paper that I wrote with the same corporate law scholar called Shareholders and Stakeholders, How Do Directors Decide? I have a paper that I wrote called Beyond the Glass Ceiling, Does Gender Matter? So I'm not going to use data from that paper, but some of the ideas from that paper are going to play a role today. And also in 2021, a friend of mine and we did a survey of members of the American Finance Association, so finance academics, essentially. And I'm going to be showing you some data from that survey. And so the title of one of the papers that we wrote out of that survey is called What's Good for Women is Good for Science. All right, so I'm going to show you some data. I'm very happy to take clarifying questions as we go along, because this may be new to you, maybe not, but okay, so there's two variables of interest that I'm going to be looking at. The first is called universalism. And this is a Schwartz human value. I'll talk briefly about what the Schwartz human value system is in a second. But universalism is defined as understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. So you're broad-minded, you emphasize wisdom, social justice, equality, a world at peace, a world of beauty, unity with nature, protecting the environment. Okay, so essentially, people who are universalist, who hold universalist values, are essentially other regarding. And hopefully it makes sense to you that I'm talking about universalism in the context of sustainability, right? So presumably it makes sense that if you're more other regarding, as defined here, you might care more about protecting the world. Okay, so I'm going to give you some data on universalism. And my data comes from the 6th wave of the World Value Survey. The World Value Survey has data on universalism for the general population across different countries. Okay, so this is a population level data on universalism. I'm also going to give you data on universalism from directors of listed companies. And this comes from a survey that I did with my corporate law co-author. I'm also going to give you data on universalism from Oxford MBA students. And I'm going to give you data on universalism from members of the American Finance Association. And this comes from the survey that I did with my co-author. Okay, so that's one variable of interest. The second variable of interest is called shareholderism. And this is a measure that I developed with my corporate law co-author, Amir Licht. And essentially what this is how much a person acting as a director favors shareholders over other stakeholders, such as employees, the community, and creditors. And I have data on measures of shareholderism from directors. So we did a survey of directors, so we measured their shareholderism. And I also took my same survey that I sent to directors and I gave it to my Oxford MBA students. So I also have data on shareholderism from Oxford MBA students. So just really briefly, Schwartz values. So what are human values? Well, they're supposed to be conceptions of the desirable, trans-situational criteria or goals, and they're supposed to essentially be motivating, so characteristics of your personality that motivate you. There's a huge literature on personal values, and there's different value systems. So the one that I'm using is the Schwartz value system. And in the Schwartz value system, there's 10 values, which are usually represented in the circular form, and universalism is one of them. I'm also later going to talk a little bit about power. I didn't define power. Hopefully it's sort of clear what power is, right? Power orientation. And also one important thing, so, like I'm not making this claim, but there's a large literature that argues that values are linked to behavior in a causal manner. Of course, different conceptions of causality sometimes, but yeah. Okay, so that's the Schwartz value system. Now the shareholderism, how do we do it? So basically I won't go into the full construction because that's not really the point of this talk, but basically what we did is we said, look, this whole discussion about shareholders and stakeholders, the only time it really matters is when there's a conflict between shareholders and stakeholders, right? If you do something that's good for the employees, they become happier, they're more productive, then the shareholders are also happier, right? So this entire discussion about trade-offs between shareholders and stakeholders only matters when the two sides disagree. Okay, now we said, well, how do we tell? How can we tell when the two sides disagree? We're like, well, we have no idea. Okay, so what did we do? We said, well, we're going to let them tell us when they disagree. So my co-author is a corporate law scholar. So he said, well, let's look at legal cases where on the one side you had shareholders, on the other side you had stakeholders. So clearly, if shareholders and stakeholders go to court, there's a conflict. Doing something for one side is obviously doing something to the detriment of the other side. Okay, so they're telling us themselves when they disagree. Okay, so what we did is we took legal cases and we designed little vignettes where we essentially said, well, suppose you're in the situation that was the basis of the legal case. How would you have decided? Okay, so we developed these vignettes and we surveyed directors using these vignettes, and then we created a measure of shareholderism, which is how much you consistently sided with the shareholders versus how much you sided with the stakeholders. Okay, so it's a measure from 1 to 6. If you're at 6, you're always pro-shareholder. If you're at 1, you always sided with the stakeholders. Okay, and the cases that we used were a case about shareholders versus consumers. That was Ford versus Dodge. We had a case about shareholders versus employees, a case about shareholders versus creditors, and shareholders versus the community. And then we also asked a corporate philosophy question. Okay, so we have this measure. You can argue, it's survey data, right? And trust me, people do argue. But for the purpose of today, I hope that you'll find this is an interesting measure. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is say, well, I have this data on universalism, which is essentially how much you care about other people. So are the current save the world narratives justified, right? So people say essentially directors are evil, they're not doing their jobs. women are obviously going to save the world, right? And the next generation is going to save the world, right? So let's look at whether we can find any evidence that these narratives are justified. And so what I did is I combined the data on universalism for the Oxford MBA students, the directors, and the directors with the sixth wave of the World Value Survey, which is the general population. Okay, so I hope you can see, I know it's a bit difficult to see these slides, but basically on the right here, what I've done is I've regressed universalism on a director dummy, a female dummy, and a student dummy. Okay, so
women directors or not?
What's that?
Are the women directors?
There are also, so here I'm not distinguishing. So I only have a female dummy as a separate category. So the female dummy essentially measures women in the population, right? So I'm not distinguishing between female, and we'll get to that later. Okay. Okay, so what do you see, or you don't see, but I'll tell you if you can't see. Essentially directors, so all the coefficients on these dummies are super significant and robust, standard errors, everything. So the director dummy, the coefficient is negative, significant. So directors are generally less universalist than members of the general population. The female coefficient is positive and significant. So women, consistent with the narrative, right? Women are more other regarding than everyone else. Okay, and the students are also more universalist. So the coefficient is positive and significant, right? So students, Oxford MBA students are more other regarding than directors and general members of the population. So the narrative seemed right? I mean, job done, so it's good, we're on track, right? Okay, so now obviously, being a skeptical finance academic, I think there's some reasons to dig deeper. Now, one of the reasons is, so I told you I've been studying directors for a while, and until recently, the game has always been to show that directors are not maximizing shareholder value. So there's an entire literature basically arguing that directors do not maximize shareholder value. I mean, that's been the game, right? To show that the directors are entrenched and blah, blah, blah. They do pet projects, they care too much about their employees. There's a paper called Enjoying the Quiet Life, where people say, well, actually what the CEOs are doing, if they're protected from monitoring, is they cater to their employees. Okay, so that was the game until now. Now, all of a sudden, people are saying, oh, but their directors are too shareholder oriented. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't get my head around this, right? Like, how do you know? Okay, so first I'm like, well, but like, how do you know, right? Because like, on the one hand, they're enjoying the quiet life, they're too friendly to the employees, but now we're saying they're actually too friendly to the shareholders. So, and then second, so people say, oh, well, we need to regulate, we need to legislate. Well, where's the evidence that that works? Like, do we know that processes work? Do we know that legislation works? I mean, show me the evidence, right? And then finally, I do a lot of work on gender. If you do a lot of work on gender or inequality more generally, you are very worried about stereotyping. And anytime that people generalize, I get very concerned, right? So I really have a problem with generalizations. So when people say, well, women are going to essentially solve the world because they're more other regarding, I'm like, well, yeah, that sounds really good, but you're essentially generalizing. You're putting all women into a bucket and saying they're all the same. And by the way, anytime that you generalize about women, you're also generalizing about men, right? So I'm like, wait a minute. So you're saying the women are all other regarding, the men are not, right? And I don't know, like, do the guys like that? I mean, is it even true, right? I mean, so I always worry when people say that gender is a sufficient statistic for preferences and behavior. And then also, if the directors, so people are also saying essentially directors are always evil, right? I mean, they just can't do anything right. But then, I'm a Chicago trained economist. So I'm like, well, but why do inefficient managerial labor markets not correct themselves. So how are all these evil people always getting to the top? It's sort of like, it doesn't make any sense, right? So don't markets work? Okay, so I'm going to be poking a bit at these narratives. So in particular, what I'm going to ask is it true that directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholders' value over stakeholder interests, which is what the Ernst & Young report claimed, and on the basis of which the European Union is, trying to figure out legislation? Is it true that we need laws to force directors to do the right thing? Is it true that the next generation will do better? And is it true that having more women will lead to better protection of stakeholders? So,
Renee,
yeah.
thank you. The Anthropocene evidence has shown that neoliberal economics is a major part of the problem of modernity, and especially of the human attack on nature. It's the technology which, especially when you look at the oil industry and when you look at animal 400 million animals a year are killed for food or something, very large number. Anyway, so because I see the Anthropocene very hardwired into the way you're looking at this part. You're accepting the corporation as given, you're accepting markets as given, and then you're looking micro at what happens within the corporation, right? But what if there is a big structural problem with the modern stock market and the large corporation and the multinational corporation?
Okay, so good question,
yeah.
But let's get to that at the end. Okay, all right, because well, you think that I'm accepting everything. Let's see if you agree when I come to the end. Okay. All right. Okay. So first question, do directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value over stakeholder interest? So what I've done here is I have this measure of shareholderism of directors, right? I can actually measure how much they favor shareholders over stakeholders. How do I do it? Well, we had this survey, right? We surveyed directors. And here, this is just all I'm doing here is I've plotted the histogram. Okay. And now, like, I would argue that if you think, so remember I said it's a measure that's, if you're at 6, you're pro-shareholder. And if you're at 1, you're always pro-stakeholder. Okay. And I would argue if you think that directors favor the shareholders over the stakeholders systematically, I would argue that this graph should be shifted more to the right. But instead, you look, it's like most of the mass is exactly in the middle. Exactly in the middle. So I'm like, well, it could be that directors favor the short-term maximization of shareholder value, but like, what do we expect? What do we want? Does it have to be like, do we want them to actually be around 2? Like, where do we want them to be? Like, this sort of looks like, well, they go right down the middle. So I'm like, not so obvious to me. Okay, now, second question, can laws force directors to do the right thing? So we did this survey across countries. So there's variation in legal regimes. And the law and finance literature argues that common law countries are the most pro-shareholder. So what I've done is I've plotted on the left, you have the full sample distribution. And then I've broken out the US and the UK, which are the main common law countries that are always discussed in the law and finance literature. The UK graph, I'm sorry, it looks like it's shifted to the right. Actually, it's not, because the 6 is not plotted. So it is actually sort of in the middle. So basically what you see is that the US and the UK, the distribution, of course, is less data. It doesn't look so nice, right? But they're still right in the middle, right? So most of the math is in the middle. And the mean difference between the US and the overall sample is 0.07, which is like economically not significant. And it's also statistically not significant, because what we did in our paper, we wanted to look at the role of the law, and what we showed is that the law does not matter for shareholder attitudes, for director shareholder attitudes. So then I'm sort of like, well, so why are we having all these laws? Are they going to work? I mean, me a bit skeptical. What about the next generation? So I took the exact same survey I gave the directors, I gave it to the Oxford MBA students. And I don't know if you know anything about the Oxford MBA students, but the way Oxford sells its MBA program is they're like, we're all about sustainability, right? So everyone who comes to Oxford is like, oh, we're into corporate purpose and sustainability, and we're all gonna do entrepreneurship and save the world, blah, 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 right? Okay, so I gave them the exact same survey I gave the directors. This is what the data looks like. Again, sorry, the 6 is missing. So it looks like it's shifted to the right, but it's actually just like the directors. Most of the mass is in the middle. So the mean here, the mean for the directors was 3.4. For the Oxford MBA students, it's 3.32. That's the mean. And here, just to make it look a bit more clear, so obviously there's fewer observations for the MBA students, so it looks a bit more choppy. But you see, so the top is the directors, the bottom is the MBA students. You see the distribution looks very similar. So the mean difference between directors and students is negative 0.08. The difference is not statistically significant, and the magnitude is not economically significant. Now, also I've done this survey. Now I have 3 cohorts of Oxford MBA students where I've done the same survey. And I asked them, do you guys think you've become more stakeholder oriented over time? And they're all like, yeah. Because we're better than the last generation, And so here what I have is the measure of shareholderism for the 3 different cohorts where I have the data. And it is true that they're becoming slightly more pro-stakeholder, but this is not economically significant. I think actually did I have this slide? I think I took the slide out, but it's like, so I surveyed all the students, of course, a lot of them didn't respond, right? But it's a fair, I think the 2022 data, I had 226 in 2022. So it's actually, and then now I have 3 cohorts. So I actually have some nice amount of data. So one thing I didn't really tell you so much is, so I did this survey of directors. I think we sent it out in 2011. 2011, nobody was talking about corporate purpose and sustainability, and a bit, right? But I would not argue that the directors would have known from the survey how they should respond to it. Okay, because we surveyed them before this was such a buzz, everyone was talking about it. So they didn't know that they were being asked about their pro-stakeholder attitudes. And also the Oxford students, they come to Oxford because they're supposed to be so pro-stakeholder, but yet they look exactly like the directors. Now, one thing that's interesting that I can't talk about today, but you saw, there's a distribution, right? So there's a variation in the attitudes, which is really interesting. But on average, they look pretty similar. So then I'm sort of like scratching my head. I'm like, well, how's the next generation going to solve everything if they look exactly like the current generation? Not so obvious. Okay, now let me get to the women. So here I have the director data. I have the shareholderism measure. And this right here is the bar is average shareholderism for women minus average shareholderism for men. This is 0 here. What does that mean? It means women, female directors in this director survey are more pro-shareholder than the male directors, which is exactly the opposite of what everyone is saying. Okay. So I provided you with some data. So I think it raises some questions about the narrative. So when confronted with situations that pit shareholders against stakeholders, directors do not look as pro-shareholder as one might think. That's the first observation. The second observation is the next generation looks remarkably like corporate directors. And the third observation is female directors in this sample are more pro-shareholder than male directors. So what does that mean? It means there's some problems with these stories. Okay, so the first problem that I'm going to talk about, how am I doing on time? Am I? Okay, cool. All right. So the first problem I'm going to talk about is selection. So people don't understand selection. Regulators don't understand selection. Actually, a lot of academics don't understand selection. So I'm going to talk about the fact that selection matters. Also, I'm going to talk about the fact that when people talk about people, they don't recognize how complicated people are, right? So people are not one-dimensional. So being other regarding is not sufficient for caring about shareholders, or sorry, for caring about stakeholders, right? Just because you care about others doesn't mean that necessarily you're always going to be on the side of the stakeholders. Why? Well, because people are combinations of characteristics, first of all, so there are other things that may matter. And also we're constrained by institutions, right? So we can't always act, you know, I may be other regarding, but I can't always act on my other regardingness. So I'm going to address the first point, the idea that selection matters. Okay, so I showed you that data, right? It said, well, generally speaking, women are more other regarding than everyone else, right? And here I'll just put it up again. So in the general population, so here what I'm plotting is universalism by gender using the World Value Survey data. So it's a general population. So there's the average universalism for men and the average universalism for women. So in the general population, women are more other regarding as measured by universalism than men. Now, this is also true among Oxford MBA students. So here I also plotted the universalism for men and the universalism for women. Women are more universalist oriented, even among Oxford MBA students. Now, but then the question is, well, can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? My argument is no, we can't generalize from the population to the boardroom. And let me illustrate this. So here what I've done is I've plotted the gender gap in values. So it's the average universalism for women minus the average universalism for men for the general population. So this is World Value Survey data. And here what I've done is I've taken the average universalism for female directors and I've subtracted the average universalism for women in the population. So I'm comparing the female directors to the women in the population. Okay, so here the gender gap in the population is positive, right? Women are more universalist than men. But what about female directors versus other women? So there is 0, so this thing is negative. Female directors are less universalist than the typical woman in the population. Now I asked you, does that make sense? I would say it makes sense, right? Like you don't get to be a director by saying, oh, I'm gonna just do everything for you and I'm gonna be so nice, right? I mean, like, let's be realistic, right? Okay, now, so there's selection, right? Now, really important, whenever you talk about women, you also talk about men, right? So there's also selection for men. So here what I've done, so this right here is the female directors compared to the women in the population. This right here is the male directors compared to men in the population. It's also negative. Right? So male directors are also less universalist than the typical man in the population. Of course, it also makes sense, right? Look at the difference for the women versus the men, right? The bar for the women is bigger than the bar for the men, right? So a female director is more different from the typical woman in the population than the male director is to the typical man in the population. So now let me illustrate the effect of selection. So basically what I've done here is the top is the gender gap in the population. so it's positive. Then here, I've just replicated those two graphs of female directors compared to women in the population, male directors compared to men in the population. And now this right here is the gender gap for directors. So it's universalism of women, female directors, minus universalism of male directors. And the point here is that you see that it's negative. So if you look at the top in the population, it's positive, the gender gap. In the boardroom, it's negative, it flips. Okay, so the female directors are less universalist than the male directors. It's the opposite of the population. And why is it the opposite? Because there's selection. And the selection is bigger for the women than for the men. Okay, now it turns out that these differences are all statistically significant, but once in this particular sample, the gender gap in universalism in the boardroom is not statistically significant. So there's no difference between men and women in terms of their other regardingness in the sample. Okay, so if there's no difference in terms of their other regardingness, why is it that the women are more pro-shareholder than the men? Well, that's because being other regarding is not sufficient. There's other things that matter. In particular, in an early paper that I wrote with my co-author Amir Licht, where we use that same measure of shareholderism, what we argued is that the more other regarding you are, the less you favor shareholders. But then, of course, there are some things that might make you favor shareholders. And in particular, we argued that power orientation would be something that would make you favor shareholders. Okay, so let's look at the selection effect for power. So now I do the exact same thing. So I have data on universalism. I also have data on power as a human value. So same thing. So the top left is the gender gap in the population. So in the general population, women are generally less power oriented than men. Now the top right is comparing the power orientation of female directors to women in the population. Female directors are much more power oriented than the typical woman in the population. Down here, I'm comparing a male director to a typical man in the population. Male directors are much more power oriented than the typical man in the population. Does it make sense? Well, again, I would say, well, look, you're a director, right? But then again, look at the size of the bars for the women as compared to the men, right? So both men and women are selected, but the selection is much bigger for the women. Okay, then you put the two together, and here's the gender gap in the boardroom, and it's women minus men. Female directors are more power oriented than male directors. Again, the gender gap in the population flips. Okay, 17? 7, okay. All right, so so here basically what I did is I sort of wanted to illustrate the overall selection effect. So the point that I'm trying to make, right, hopefully it's clear, is you can't generalize. You can't say, well, in the population, we know this particular thing about men and women, and this should also apply to the boardroom. So you can't generalize unless you understand the selection process. And show me the research on this. I would love to know where the research on this is, but there's very little research on this. So this is a really important area for research. Okay, and just to illustrate the selection effects, I hope you can see this, but basically I've taken shareholderism and I put because I have the Oxford MBA student data and I have the director data. So I've regressed shareholderism on power, forget the other variables, and universalism, and then there's a female dummy and a student dummy. And then I've interacted the students with the female. So I have, on the left, I only have the students in these two columns. So you see, among the students, also power orientation is associated with more shareholder orientation, but universalism is associated with more pro-stakeholder attitudes. because it's negative. And women among MBA students who might be closer to the general population than the directors are less pro-stakeholder, pro-shareholder, sorry. Okay, then I put the students and the directors together over here. You see there's no significant difference. So the students are not significantly different from the directors. But then if you put in an interaction term, you see that female directors are more pro-shareholder, but the female students are less pro-shareholder. And the students are more likely to be closer to the population than the directors are. So again, you see the selection, right? So you can't generalize from the population to the boardroom. So just briefly, because I'm running out of time. So then the second point I wanted to make, so selection matters, but also institutional environment matters. So here what I've done is I've taken on average, women are more pro-shareholder in the data than men, but there's variation across countries. So what I've done here is I've taken the gender difference, so women minus men, and I've plotted it across countries. So in Australia, women are more pro-shareholder. In Canada, women are less pro-shareholder than men. In Germany, they're more pro-shareholder. In India, they're less pro-shareholder. In Ireland, they're less pro-shareholder. In Israel, they're less pro-shareholder. In Italy, they're more pro-shareholder, right? So you see there's variation across institutional environments. And why might that be the case? Well, probably it's not hard to think about, well, maybe the selection processes are different in different countries, right? Because who gets to be a female director depends on the institutional environment, right? So, so the institutional environment matters. Okay, so some points. Can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? No. Is being other regarding sufficient to care about stakeholders? I would say no. Can we generalize across institutional environments? You saw that slide, no, right? And do processes always work? And my answer is no. So how to save the world? So what's my point? So there are no easy answers, right? There are no easy answers, but also processes may matter. I'm not saying that they don't, but they need to be informed. Questioning assumptions is important. Evidence is important, right? So the fact that the European Union is saying on a basis of an Ernst & Young report, which even my students say probably took them a month to put together, you know, the fact that they use this as evidence to justify regulation is just like, you know, like it's just it makes you want to just curl up in a little ball, right? Evidence is important, like solid, serious evidence is important, but also humility is important. We don't know everything, right? We have to question, we have to be open-minded. And, you know, you may say, well, that was a really negative, pessimistic talk, but actually one thing that you'll see, my evidence suggests that people can matter because values, human values are associated with shareholderism. And so there are some people who do care systematically more about stakeholders than other people. The literature, we haven't even started talking about how do you get the right people? Show me the literature on nominating committees. There's like nothing out there, right? I'm generalizing a bit, but you know, so how do you choose the right people? We say, well, let's regulate, but we don't talk about how do you get the right people in place? Maybe that's the right approach. So is there hope? Well, so I confronted my students with their own data. Some of them found it really hard, right? They did not all like my lecture, but some people, like one student came up to me recently and said, this was the best lecture of the entire MBA. And generally speaking, I found that they said, you gave us a challenge, which was difficult, but we learned a lot. And then they also said, we wish more of our MBA classes were challenging. And so what I take from that is that the next generation, there is hope, but we have to have the courage to be able to challenge them, to not give into institutional pressure to dumb everything down, and to help them develop their critical thinking in order to be able to tackle these major challenges. So I think there is hope because they actually appreciated. They said, oh, this was hard, but we've learned something. And I think we have to give into that. And then also, finally, to end on this note, so I have data on finance academics. So how do we look in terms of the human values that I was talking about? And so there's two values here that are interesting. So universalism here is at the bottom. And here what I've done is I've compared finance academics to members of the general population. Okay, so the bar down here, the 0.015 means finance academics are more universalist oriented than the typical member of the population. Now, it looks like a small number, but remember, directors are not more universalist. So directors are actually less universalist than the general population, but we as academics are more universalist. Okay, and then also there's another measure, benevolence. So compared to the typical member of the population, finance academics are much more benevolent. Okay, so I look at this and it gives me hope because I'm like, well, I think we are in a position where, we have the right values. And if we keep on building the evidence, challenging the narratives, and, challenging policymakers and saying, we need to question assumptions, we need to have humility, then maybe we can help save the world. So that's it for me.
Let's listen to talk. So the question time, please. First question.
Hi, Renee. I just wanted to ask, I take your point on the selection. I think it's really important. In some countries, the selection process, as it was, has been scuppered by gender quotas on boards. And I wonder if you observe any differences where more women have been brought on boards and the companies will choose without the regulation.
Yeah, so very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the data to look at this because my data predates most of the quota movement. But obviously it should matter, right? So if you have women on boards who are put there as a result of a quota, then I would imagine that their preferences and their individual characteristics are quite different from the other women. And so, of course, an interesting question is how that would play out, right? And actually also if that's what you want.
Question.
Why didn't you compare shareholderism with sustainability? I can't quite say the word. Why compare shareholderism with a vague, broad concept of universalism? When you could compare it with pursuit of net zero, biodiversity, and CSR as opposite sustainability. That seems to be more aligned with shareholderism. It's an idea, isn't it?
Well, so shareholderism incorporates how much you care about stakeholders, right? So the more positive the value is, the more you care about shareholders, but the smaller the value is, the more you care about stakeholders. So it is a measure that already incorporates the trade-off.
The world is asking for us to change in the direction of those three areas. You think you want to measure the values associated with those versus financial shareholderism, and which was the preference for the financial shareholders in traditional finance versus this new world. I entirely agree with you that financial shareholders includes stakeholders.
No, I'm not saying financial shareholders include, I'm saying our measure incorporates the trade-off between shareholders and stakeholders, right? So we don't have biodiversity in there, but we have consumers, we have employees, we have creditors, and we have corporate philosophy, which you could argue could be related to, environment or whatever.
In this case, I think you need to clarify this. It's clearly financial value that still is being pursued in a large part of the economic sector.
Well, but that's actually a narrative that I'm questioning. I'm questioning that narrative, right? I'm like, you look at the data and it's not so obvious. So that's the point, right?
You include the other values in your shareholders. You are sort of diluting that the powerful pursuit of financial value, which is what they are actually doing. You know,
Well, that's what you say, but where's your evidence is exactly my
there are
point.
lots of banks and fund managers who by chance reveal that that's what they're actually doing, rather than their public pursuit of these other stakeholder values. By somebody, a whistleblower or a slippage or a mistake, they reveal they're not giving up on pure financial value, and the pursuit of the other values is a superficial thing to fend off any dispute or investigation of what they're doing.
Well, so maybe I'd like to give other people a chance to participate, but also can I ask you to please read my paper? Yeah, because then, yeah, so, yeah, thank you. And then maybe the measure will be more clear once you actually read the paper. So.
Thank you very much for the question. Can we take one from the online audience? We have a question here. Thank you for the insightful presentation. Can I please ask how you propose we develop the critical thinking of our students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one thing that I've done at Oxford, which also I would say that not all students like it, but I actually think that's a good thing. So I think we cater too much to trying to please students. Pleasing students is not going to help them develop their critical thinking. And so one thing that I try to do is I try to bring as much research into my lectures as possible. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the right approach, but you can see that if you show the evidence to the students, if you have research-backed teaching, I think that is very powerful. And I think, you know, the students actually appreciate it. Not everyone, obviously, because some people don't understand research and, you know, evidence. But for me personally, that's the way to go. I'm not saying I have all the answers, right? I think there could be different approaches, but I think we have to like step back from this. Let's just dumb everything down and give the students what they want, because then we get higher teaching evaluations and then we get more like higher ratings. And then, you know, we put out these people. So how are the students going to save the world if we don't teach them critical thinking, right? So I think that's a real problem.
Right, so please, question.
Very interesting, and you posit shareholder orientation versus stakeholder orientation. But at least one group of stakeholders, and probably more, are actually essential for maximizing shareholder value. So there is evidence that companies in consumer markets where consumerism has gone green do better by behaving in a way that those consumers prefer.
Yes, but so that's exactly, so when we construct our measure, that's exactly what we say. We say, in many cases, the interests of stakeholders and shareholders will be aligned, right? So the only time this discussion matters is if there is a conflict. And so you have to remember, so our measure is based on conflicts. But generally speaking, I completely agree with you that doing something for stakeholders is also good for shareholders, right? Because otherwise it would make no sense, right? Because obviously consumers, if they want green stuff, let's give them green stuff, right?
So some people say the implication is you need to educate the public to be green. Don't worry about the companies, they will follow.
Exactly, exactly. But that's what, again, my point, education is important, right?
Okay, so we have time for the final
Yeah,
question.
I have a question. So thinking about the directors, maybe as a person, he wants to do all the good stuff, but as a director, as the role, he receives pressure from regulation and government. So as a researcher, how do we really look at that kind of thing?
Yeah, but very good question. But so that's exactly one of the points is I'm like, okay, so the directors, they look like the students. Now, suppose we think that they still behave the wrong way. Then the question is, why are their beliefs not translating into the right actions? Then it must be, like you say, it must be there's something in the external environment. Maybe it's incentive structures, maybe it's regulation, right? And so then you say, well, so now what's my research question? My research question is, what is it about the environment that causes them to behave against sort of their values. And then when if we think there's a problem, we need to change that, right? So we don't try to force the directors to think a certain way. We fix the incentive, we fix the regulation, you know. So basically it's about saying, well, where is the problem, right? And essentially the data I provided is trying to illustrate that maybe the problem is not where we think it is. And so what does that mean? Well, we need to do research on where we think the problem actually is, right? And then we need to fix those things, right? So, so basically, I think there's a lot of research to be done, which we really need to do, but what we can't do is accept these very facile narratives without challenging the assumptions on which they're based, right?
Right, we know there are still many questions that come up, and then we can continue the discussion during the lunchtime. And once again, thank you very much for the insightful.
Okay, just quick announcement. Thanks, Jay, for chairing the session. Thanks very much, Renee, for the interesting talk. We're now moving into the subgroup sessions. Right, so all of the special interest groups, or a lot of the special interest groups, have got sessions that they've set up now. In this room, the corporate finance and asset pricing SIG, and then the others they're set out on the other events page of the booklet, and the rooms are outside and up the stairs. And then we will be back in this room at 2 o'clock for the AGM. Okay. So. Sure, I'm going to leave that.